Hello from Washington, D.C. I'm Shihoko Gerto, Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director of the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center. Thanks very much for joining our discussion today on the way forward for US-Japan cooperation under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. During his first visit to Tokyo last month as president, Joe Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the White House stated would strengthen US ties to the region to define the coming decades for technological innovation and the global economy. A total of 14 countries, including the United States, are now prepared to discuss moving forward towards a shared economic vision for the region. The number of countries that are prepared to mull IPEF as a way forward to establish rules of economic engagement is far higher than expected. And the White House is keen to note that that represents the regional, political, and economic diversity of the Indo-Pacific. But how will this lead to greater economic coordination across Asia and for cooperation between Washington and Tokyo in particular, in light of changing competitive realities and shifts in the regional order of the Indo-Pacific? We have a great lineup of speakers to address those and other key issues. But before I turn to them, I would like to invite the Wilson Center's Vice President for Programs, Abe Denmark, to help frame the discussion and the issues we'll be covering today. Abe, over to you.
Thank you, Shihoko. Well, first, welcome everybody to the Wilson Center. We're very pleased to have you, and we're thrilled to have such a terrific group of scholars, experts, and practitioners with us this morning. The IPEF that was announced while the president was in Japan is clearly a critical element of US strategy towards the Indo-Pacific. And the White House, as Shihoko mentioned, has declared that IPEF not only meets the needs of the global economy for the 21st century, but also allows for a stronger partnership with like-minded countries. And Japan, obviously, is a key partner for the success of IPEF, and it is expected to further deepen economic ties and cooperation between Tokyo and Washington. Yet at the same time, the Indo-Pacific's economic architecture continues to grow more complex. Even Japan is a leading member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or CPTPP, which promotes free and fair trade in the Indo-Pacific. And Tokyo is also launching its own economic sustainability program called the New Form of Capitalism. So I am very interested in what the scholars and practitioners that Shihoko has gathered for us today, what they think about the outlook for Japan-US economic cooperation, our economic leadership in the Indo-Pacific, and how our shared political and economic values can help further prosperity as well as the advanced democracy and the rule of law across the region. So thank you very much both to Shihoko for her leadership at the Wilson Center on these issues, for each of our four speakers, as well as to Sharona, John Tyler, and the rest of our AV team for putting on yet another terrific event for the Wilson Center. And with that, Shihoko, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Abe. So let's now turn to our panelists. I'm delighted to welcome Noriyuki Shikata, Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs with the Prime Minister's Office of Japan. We also have Kristen Vikasi, Associate Professor at the University of Maine's Political Science Department and also the School of Policy and International Affairs, and Saori Katada, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. And finally, we have David Bowling, Director of Japan and Asian Trade at the Eurasia Group, based here in Washington. We are taking questions because this is a live event. You can email us at asia@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet us at Asia Program. Again, the email is asia@wilsoncenter.org. Twitter is @Asia Program. So, Shikata-san, let me first turn to you. I know you just got back from Singapore, accompanying Prime Minister Kishida at the Shangri-La Dialogues. And of course, before that, the Prime Minister has been extremely busy on the foreign policy front because he had hosted not only President Biden, but also the Quad Summit meeting in Tokyo. Expectations for Japan as a regional stabilizer are on the rise, and Japan's role in defining roles of economic engagement in particular is certainly increasing, especially over the last 5 years since the US withdrawal from the TPP. But of course, now we have the White House come up with its own vision for regional economic cooperation. Could you share your views on how Japan sees IPEF and if it will impact Japan's trade strategy in the Indo-Pacific? And how can IPEF further Tokyo's economic relations with Washington beyond the existing bilateral trade agreements for goods and the digital trade deal?
Well, thank you very much, Shoko-san, for your kind invitation and introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back to the Wilson Center and be delighted to engage discussion with other experts. As you mentioned, during President Biden's visit to Tokyo, bilateral visit and Quad Summit, the United States made lots of efforts to launch IPEF. And Japan was very closely consulted on this launch. And Prime Minister Kishida really welcomed and expressed his very strong support for the launching of IPEF. And the IPEF, from our viewpoint, has a great strategic significance, demonstrating the US commitment, especially economic commitment to the Indo-Pacific region after leaving the TPP, as you mentioned. From the perspective of the Japanese government, I think IPEF will be a very, very important framework, especially in two key respects. Number one is the relationship with the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the most important pillar of Japan's foreign policy. IPEF will be a very important tool for achieving or realizing FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. IPEF is not only important just to pursue economic prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region, which is a pillar of FOIP, but also in building a rule-based economic order in the region. And that is the basis for the realization of FOIP. As we understand, the framework IPEF provides for creating common economic rules among partner countries, including ASEAN members, would be very conducive to future economic collaboration across the Indo-Pacific region. The second point is, as was earlier mentioned, Prime Minister Kishida has been promoting the initiative under the theme of a new form of capitalism, which tries to address some of negative economic impacts that we are facing, such as climate change or income inequality, or the gap between the center and the countryside. So we wish to upgrade our capitalism to be sustainable and inclusive, especially in light of the challenges presented by authoritarian regimes. And this is something which we wish to pursue our efforts in collaboration with other like-minded countries. So our view is that what the IPEF is trying to address has much commonality with the agenda under the new form of capitalism. And we'll be working very closely with the private sector as well, and with other like-minded countries, we are creating new rules beyond the existing trade agreements. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Shigeta-san, thank you so much for your insight. I know that the White House has really touted IPEF as a new rules for economic engagement that is for the 21st century, and it's not just simply a trade deal per se. Your point about Japan and this approach to new capitalism addresses some of the bigger issues that really cannot be addressed by traditional trade agreements, but nonetheless are very critical for social stability and economic growth, not just in Japan, but across the world. And I think there's a lot of interest in understanding Prime Minister Kishida's approach and whether it is transferable, applicable to other countries as well. So I know that there is, I hope we can follow up on this as we move forward in this conversation. But before I do that, let me turn to David. So David, you recently left USTR to join the Eurasia Group, but I'm sure the memories of negotiating TPP on behalf of the United States are deeply ingrained in your memory. The White House has been pleased to announce that the IPEF membership is as broad as it is, but it's also noteworthy that Japan was instrumental in securing key Southeast Asian nations to be willing to sign on to this initial exploratory phase. Can IPEF deepen US-Japan economic ties? And also, how serious do you think is US commitment to be an economic leader in the region? And where does IPEF fit into the broader US economic strategy in the region?
Thanks, Yoko, and it's great to join everyone. Really pleased to participate in this. And so I'll just jump right in with my thoughts about IPEF and CPTPP, because I think how you look at IPEF really depends a lot on how you look at CPTPP. And I see the world basically in two camps right now. And one's what I call the idealistic or idealist camp. And this would be more the camp that is going to probably be disappointed with IPEF because they really feel like we need to go back to CPTPP and that we ought to be moving in that direction. And I see that this camp has a lot of folks in the foreign policy community, experts, as well as national security community, who see the fact that the United States pulled out of TPP as a tremendous loss for the United States and its prestige in the region and its geostrategic edge. And I agree with them about that. It was a great loss. And as you mentioned, I worked on TPP when I was in the government. That's why I wanted to join the government in 2015, was to work on the Japan negotiations. I really wish it had passed. Many of my colleagues at USTR had worked on it for years before I joined in 2015, but it didn't pass. And it wasn't a fluke that it didn't pass. There were reasons that it didn't pass. So I really feel like it's best to move on. It's been 6 years. And so that puts me in what I call the realist camp. And I probably would say I'm a reluctant realist, but that's where I've landed. And if you come to the conclusion that returning to TPP right now is not possible politically, and that it's just too ambitious, and that doing a really ambitious trade agenda right now is not in the cards politically, then IPEF makes a lot of sense. It's not bold. It's not really ambitious in my view, but it's certainly better than nothing. And if you want to do something on trade right now, and I do, is this the way to do it? I think that this is one way to go about it. Because when I look at the politics, it's just really hard to do something super ambitious in the United States on trade. So I say, to paraphrase Irving Kristol, I'm a TPP fan who's been mugged by the current reality of trade politics in the United States. So that's sort of how I look at this right now. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about what I saw come out of the Kishida-Biden meeting, the leader's statement, the fact sheet, and the press conference transcript. The leader's statement announcing IPEF, I was impressed by the number of countries, and Shihoko, you mentioned this, that the Biden administration and Japan was able to pull together. I was particularly impressed that they got India and Indonesia to join. If you talk to folks in the trade community, India and Indonesia are not easy countries to deal with. I mean, if you're going to work as a trade negotiator with those countries, you're going to have a big bottle of aspirin on your desk because there's going to be a lot of headaches. And so I'm impressed that they got India and Indonesia to join. I'll be watching carefully to see if India and Indonesia actually join the trade pillar, that first pillar. It's an open framework, and that's very TPP-like, right? I mean, they've said it twice in the leader statement that they're inviting other countries to join. So that's TPP-like and interesting. They did say that they are launching collective discussions toward future negotiations. So that's a little bit, fuzzy as to where this is going, but they did mention the word negotiations. They set out the 4 trade pillars very clearly: trade, supply chains, clean energy to decarbonization, tax and anti-corruption. But they said that the trade pillar would talk about digital. They said including but not limited to digital. So that was interesting to me that labor and environment wasn't mentioned by the leaders. I expect there were some sensitivities among some of the members about that. But what's the role of Japan here? I see the role of Japan here being like Keith Richards to the Rolling Stones. And my point is, if you've ever read his autobiography, one of the things that Keith Richards did throughout his time with the Rolling Stones is he wanted to keep the band together. I mean, he really worked hard to keep the band together. And I see Japan having that role, being able to keep the band together throughout this discussion that's going to take months. Japan is really well thought of in Southeast Asia and seemed to be a fair player. So I think Japan's going to play a critical role in the success of IPEF. As far as the White House fact sheet, there was a lot of interesting language in there that was TPP-like. It mentioned that the group represents 40% of GDP of the world. That's very TPP-like. That was frequently just used to describe TPP. It talks about we're going to decide on the rules of the road. And that really struck me because that's not language the Trump administration used. The Trump administration, I don't recall talking about rules of the road very much. The Obama administration did. Also, it talks about foreign direct investment in the region. It talks about export services. Again, those are things the Trump administration did not highlight much at all or have a whole lot of concern about. I mean, the Trump administration was more focused on not foreign direct investment by the United States, but bringing the investment back. So those are some interesting things that stood out to me. The language in the White House fact sheet was a little bit fuzzy, I thought, when it came to describing the pillars. It talked about, for example, the trade pillar being the resilient economy. And in terms like that, the supply chains was resilient economy. The trade pillar was connected economy. So that was a bit puzzling to me, but anyway, that's the way they decided to describe it. They did not use the word negotiation, which did strike me. For the trade pillar, they focused on digital, and then they did mention labor and environment. I think this is a place where Japan's going to play an important role too, because I don't see a whole lot of enthusiasm myself on Capitol Hill or in the administration to really push a digital agenda aggressively. But I think other countries in the region do want that. And that's probably part of the package, right? You have digital, but you also have labor and environment. They did not mention other topics like competition policy or sanitary, phytosanitary, and those topics have been raised in the past as topics that would be discussed. So I'll be watching to see if that comes up. Wrapping this up on the White House fact sheet, I would say, there's no market access, or I should say there's no mention of market access. So who knows, it could still pop up, but there is a silver lining, I suppose, if there's no market access on the table, and that is I don't really see India, Indonesia, Vietnam, countries like that being that interested in lowering their tariffs. And they have some very high ones. So that may be an example where not having market access on the table does get more people at the table. And then obviously this is not a free trade agreement, so it will not be voted on by Congress. And again here, putting on my realist hat, I mean, do you really think Congress wants to do much on trade right now? I say no, they don't. I don't see indications of that. I don't see that changing after November. If the Republicans take control of the Congress, this is a very different Republican Party than a few years ago. It is animated by Trumpism, and there's a great trade skepticism, I think, right now in significant elements of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So if you can't get trade promotion authority through, if you can't lower tariffs anyway through legislation, then why do it? And so this may be, like I said, the better approach right now, given the reality of the trade politics. So I'll finish up on the press conference transcript. Of course, the press conference made big news because of President Biden's comments about Taiwan. But if you read through it, it's interesting. TPP was mentioned 9 times in the press conference. IPEF was mentioned 13 times. So they're kind of close there. IPEF beat out TPP, which is probably a good thing. I think it was the first question that Prime Minister Kishida got was about TPP. So that is indicative of the ongoing interest in Japan. And I understand why Japan has really sunk a lot into pushing CPTPP forward, to bringing it, to basically for it to survive. So Japan has a keen interest in it. Kishida did also repeat 3 times by my counting that the United States ought to return to CPTPP. And then Prime Minister from New Zealand said it as well later. I'm not sure that's that helpful at this point. I understand why Japan needs to say it. If I was advising either of the prime ministers, I would say, okay, you can say it, but you ought to say something in addition. That is, we want you to come back to TPP and we'd like to have a discussion with you to hear United States, what's the problem with TPP for you? Because I think 80–90% of TPP is probably okay for the United States. It's the 10 to 20% on labor, on automobiles, on currency that's a problem. And it'd be a more helpful and constructive discussion if we focus on that than just saying, hey, come back to the same agreement in 2016 that was terribly unpopular then. It's just not that helpful in my view. But let me wrap up by saying, in sum, I think IPEF is going to help U.S.-Japan relations. Japan will play an extremely important role in its success. Its successes will be limited. They won't be sweeping, in my view. It's not a grand slam, but it's probably a single. And after the negotiations, it could even be a double. And in this political environment, the United States, I think that's pretty good. So that's where I end up on IPEF and CPTPP.
Thank you, David, for that very thoughtful and cautious optimism towards IPEF. I think one of you said it wasn't particularly bold nor ambitious, but at the same time, it doesn't need congressional approval. It should hopefully be able to move forward. There hasn't really been much U.S. opposition to IPEF at all, which is also quite noteworthy, I think. But let me turn now to Saudi. You are, of course, a professor at USC, and you're an author of a book entitled Japan's New Regional Reality and Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia-Pacific. You provided in the book an in-depth analysis of Japan's role in shaping the economic order in the Indo-Pacific and the dynamics of domestic politics, as well as foreign policy goals in shaping the economic agenda. My question to you is, so what are the criticisms or concerns that are coming out of Japan today from the political establishment, from Japanese businesses regarding IPEF, if there are any? And a very straightforward question, why has IPEF become such a common term in the Japanese popular media to an extent that is almost unheard of in any other country? Does IPEF actually kind of play up the hopes for Japan that it will lead to greater US commitment to the region and to act as an effective counterbalance to China?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Shihoko, for plugging my book. Japanese version of which just came out. So if Japanese audience is listening, it came out from Nikkei publication. So thank you. But it's a great honor to be here at the Wilson Center with Nori and Kristen and David too. This is such an exciting time, and IPEF is obviously an important initiative on the part of the U.S. government. It's clear that Japan is quite excited to hear this come out finally after kind of bits and pieces coming out since the fall of last year. The reason why Japan is so keen in plugging to the IPEF is that this is a way that U.S. is engaged in the Asia-Pacific, or now called Indo-Pacific overall, that any kind of significant sign of U.S. commitment is a welcome thing. And also I would say, and in my intervention here, I will kind of elaborate a little bit more, is that Japan has been quite involved and have been being part of the formulation in some ways. Now, Shihoko has already said about kind of a membership and then things like that about IPEF in shaping this this initiative. So in some ways, this is kind of obviously this is American initiative, but some collaborative work coming from Japan. So that's the kind of excitement. In any case, so what I would like to talk about here is to talk about the way that Japan sees this kind of US initiative and is dealing with this changing geoeconomics and geopolitics of the regional economy overall in the in the 2020, in the decade of 2020s, looking various kind of new normal that is happening because of the COVID, because of the supply chain disruption, because of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So I do agree, first of all, that, as David noted, that there are two camps to see IPEF. There are the kind of idealists, or those who think, the idealists, those think that, well, US should come back to TPP, and this is at the best the second best, at the best, kind of a second choice, while others say, this can really grow into something quite new and innovative and probably fitting of the challenges of 21st century. Again, as I mentioned, that Japan is happy at this point, quite happy that US is engaging with the Indo-Pacific economic situation. Especially Japan is facing this challenge of the China applying to join CPTPP. Japan needs some kind of counterweight to really manage this this regional economic environment, given that the rule-based order is crucial for the Japanese economy. So let me talk about the new normal and the kind of major economic challenges I see in the region, first of all, and how Japan-US relationship would be dealing with it, especially coming from the Japanese perspective. In some ways, as a scholar, kind of broader view of how things, the things I see. The new normal in this region is the kind of the basic rise of geoeconomics. This is a term that coming into place quite, obviously the Wilson Center's, this initiative itself is geoeconomics. But so the first part of it, so I see major three in the context of IPEF and Japan, is that one is that obviously the regional global supply chains are now quite precarious. And there seems to be the sense that factory China, which used to dominate in the last decade and a half, is no longer a benign practice. So here, economic dependence or interdependence are now seen as either risky or at the worst can be weaponized. So there is a rise of sense of economic security and securitization of the economy, now quite a prevalent feature of these days in the region. The other new normal is the kind of related is the pursuing the most efficient and economical production is no longer the ultimate goal for the the government, obviously, but even for the businesses. So in some ways, just instead of just in time, just in case practice is quite important. And now with some sense of inequality, sustainability, investing in people, environment, and all other things which was thought to be, kind of a secondary consideration for the kind of cutting edge businesses are now becoming crucial component. Obviously, what comes with it is the rising prices. And in the US and even in Japan, some of the inflation is being major headline items these days. We can talk about it later if that's the part of the question. But all in all, this is a major change. And final change is that even though the total decoupling between the United States and Chinese economies is probably quite unlikely, there is an increased sense of the pressure on the part of Japan and all the countries in this region, in western part of the Pacific, that there is some sense of pressure to choose between the United States and China, and kind of choosing side, and especially applying to the kind of issues of values and norms and so on as a foundation of the division. So in this new normal, how this can Japan and along with United States or engaging United States, or at least try to deal with it. So and what are the main challenges? And I see, I would like to kind of put it in kind of three buckets. One is definitely the China-US relations, or US-China relations. And Japan definitely is the first entity to seriously engage with United States, or entice as engagement in the United States in the region as possible. But this is not at the expense of isolating China. So in some ways, avoiding China's isolation and engaging the United States is the critical part that Japan is playing a major role. Of course, I guess everybody already mentioned that keep requesting US to come back to TPP might not be the best approach to this, but there are other ways that Japan can engage. And Shihoko has already mentioned, again, Southeast Asia kind of coming on board really would be kind of one way that Japan's role was probably quite important. In many ways, the coalition building within this region is something that Japan could play a major role. For its credit, I think Biden administration understands that and listens to Japan quite seriously, and in some ways, the IPEF is showing that. On the other hand, obviously, this kind of approach, it has as a very kind of kind of very difficult act, and it can backfire on Japan. So Japanese government has to work very carefully at that. The second part is that this kind of work is in some ways in an inventive way to engage the private sector, both from the United States and then Japan. So, there's, I've been writing about de-risking some of the infrastructure investment, where government can play a role, where private sector can come in and kind of enhance the power and prosperity of this region. And this is the critical part that Japanese government can take a big role. Meanwhile, this is kind of a significant balancing act, because there's two kind of opposing forces pulling the government. On one side, the Japanese government and the American government need to de-risk, so that one of the IPEF's kind of a signature thing is infrastructure investment, but it's not the government investing. It's well, part of it, but most of the funding would come from the private sector, and making sure, like a Blue Dot network and things like that, making sure that risk is minimized is quite important. On the other hand, securitization of the economy and economic security is getting increasingly important, and that balancing act is a quite crucial part that Japanese government, as well as the American ones, engaging the American government, I should say, would be able to play a major role. And this is not an easy one. The third one is definitely what Shikata-san said about keeping the fort of the rule-based economic order in the region. This is by far the kind of significant part. The US has been taking a major role in it in the last 70 years at least, and this has to keep coming. And even though US might not be able to come back to TPP or might not be interested in TPP, Japan should really take this CPTPP as its own, I guess, baby or whatever the kind of metaphor is, and keep going with it. TPP is a living agreement. It can expand membership, which is kind of a challenge on one side, but it's a blessing on the other. And also it can change its form. It might be able to take some of the cues from IPEF to really evolve into something which is definitely, no question, 21st century one, even with or without the United States. So overall, I would like to kind of conclude by saying that Japan has a critically important role to play, and US-Japan relations continue to be crucial and important in this region and then for the world. Now, I would like to note that Japan is an important partner to the United States. The kind of old kind of relationship where Japan used to be a sidekick, or maybe the reactive supporter to the US is no longer. And I would really like to see the Biden administration realize this. I think it has realized this already. And Japan leadership also realizes it and take the lead in many of these vital issues that are happening in this region. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Saudi, thank you so much for your insights. You provided a lot of food for thought there, and perhaps some tough love for the Japanese government to really embrace CPTPP as its own and really run with it. But I want to also note your points about supply chain resiliency and what we are expecting from that, and the role of the private sector in ensuring economic security in the region. And so let me turn to Kristen. Of course, the Wilson Center, one of our mandates is really to bridge the worlds of ideas and academic research with policymakers and those who are practitioners in government. And so I'm excited that to highlight the fact that you recently wrote a book entitled Risk Management Strategies of Japanese Companies in China. And I know your current research focuses on cooperation in Southeast Asia between Japan, United States, and China concerning supply chains and infrastructure development. So in light of your research, which touches upon so many of the key buzzwords that we are seeing bandied about by both the United States and Japan, how does IPEF actually meet some of those goals? And I'm also wondering, when we talk about supply chain resiliency, which industries, which sectors in particular would benefit from greater coordination? And how does this allow the private sector to ensure healthy competition and not simply form a cartel?
Thank you so much for both having me here today, as well as those great questions to start off. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bilateral and multilateral efforts that have happened over the last few years for supply chain resiliency in the region, and then think about a couple of challenges that we have moving forward. So we've been talking a lot about IPEF, and I will talk about IPEF, but I also want to take just one step back, because to think about supply chain resiliency and the sectors that are focused upon in IPEF, and then I think that those come from, first, they come from the Quad negotiations, but before that, they also largely are coming out of US-Japan bilateral approaches. And so we have, when at the Biden-Kishida meeting, and then at the Quad meeting following that, we could see sort of this fractal nature of the different agreements, where if you kind of go back one step, you start to see this sort of the same patterns and same sorts of initiatives happening. And so thinking about this in terms of sort of the big points I see is that I think that US-Japan economic cooperation, and I'll talk a little bit about the core partnership, between the US and Japan in a minute, but that US-Japan economic cooperation is going to be the blueprint for how that happens in the broader region. It will be the blueprint for how it happens in the Quad, and also the blueprint for how real things might happen within IPEF, particularly within this resiliency pillar. So success in deepening of US-Japan bilateral initiatives within either the Quad or perhaps the core partnership will be necessary, but not sufficient condition for these broader multilateral initiatives to succeed. But both Japan and the US are going to need to appease domestic audiences, right? So we've already been talking about this, particularly with the backlash in the United States against trade and trade agreements, or perhaps economic initiatives. But in Japan and the United States, there are domestic audiences that are rightly concerned about foreign competition, both at the high end and low end of manufacturing. They're worried about technological development, technological competition in key sectors like semiconductors, battery production, critical minerals, places like that. And in order to develop resilience initiatives in meaningful ways, I think that Japan and the United States are going to need to lead the way. All of that, so that's the really big challenge. But that said, I think that supply chain resilience is actually a very, very good place to try and build a rule-based order, and to try and get past some of these domestic concerns, because our supply chain problems are very visible right now. And there's, I think, a lot more agreement about building rules for transparency, for accountability within supply chain resilience initiatives versus trying to build them through something like a trade agreement or some sort of trade framework. And in particular, pulling on Sauri's comment for a minute about engaging the private sector, supply chain resilience is a really great way to engage the private sector that we haven't seen. So when we think about supply chain resilience, this is generally, very simply put, abstractly, the ability to respond deftly to a crisis, to a supply chain crunch, to a choke point, to decrease potential for the weaponization of a supply chain or international trade. Concretely, what this typically means is geographic diversification, either of a production choke point, right, to either make the battery or make the semiconductor, but it's also geographic diversification in technological development, and in order to try and reduce similar kinds of risk. Now, we see geopolitical risks in production choke points, but the geopolitical risks in technological diversification are in some ways much more serious, and they are more difficult to overcome. And this is where I see the core partnership and as well as the Quad, but perhaps even more IPEF having a role. So the timeframes are really different here. If you want to open a new factory, that can take a number of years to do. But if you want to develop the technological know-how to build that new factory, that can take a lot longer as you try and develop new talent, start new programs, et cetera. So we have. There we go. So we have in these bilateral initiatives, particularly at first looking at the US-Japan core partnership. This was announced a little over a year ago at a Suga-Biden meeting in April of 2021. It focuses on a whole bunch of different sectors, including 5G, open radio access network, a civil space program, quantum technologies, critical minerals, cybersecurity, infrastructure, global health, and even more. So this is a very, very broad level and very high levels of technology, right? Thinking about emerging technologies, et cetera. There was a fact sheet put out from the May 23rd meeting, which provided a lot of specific activities since the April 2021 announcement. So this is a really good sign for US-Japan cooperation, that in the May 23rd fact sheet, we see not only announcements of new meetings and new initiatives, although there are a lot of new meetings and initiatives that are also included in that fact sheet, but also we see very specific concrete items. For example, there's cooperation on some semiconductor, there's cooperation on batteries, on midstream processing for some critical minerals, not just mining. We see investments from the private sector. We see public-private partnerships in a number of different sectors. So these are really concrete things that the United States and Japan are starting to do. There's also, of course, a lot of meetings involving, including the Economic 2+2 meeting. This, in many ways, complements the economic security as national security mindset or approach that we've seen very explicitly introduced since the Trump administration, and also in Japan with the new economic security bill, which we haven't talked about yet today, but maybe it's something that we could bring up of how that facilitates some of these new initiatives. Now, the Quad initiatives really complement what Japan, the US-Japan partnership in a lot of ways. So there's a Quad minus US, Japan, Australia, India supply chain resiliency initiative as well. And this is really about increasing best practices on supply chain resilience, including things like security, transparency, accountability, within supply chains, as well as trying to introduce new, particularly Japanese investment in India, which has been a long-term goal. It's been a little bit slow to start on more concrete projects, but it's using very similar kinds of language that we also see in the Quad, as well as IPEF. So things like there's a common statement of principles on critical technology supply chains that from the Quad, including security, transparency, autonomy, and integrity. I also see a lot to like this. It's very abstract as principles, but one of the key reasons that we're seeing some of these non-resilient supply chains in like chips, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals is that those supply chains are extremely opaque. It's unclear right where the different components are coming from. With some critical minerals, it's unclear what type of labor situation it is, what a fair price for the minerals might be, where they're being mined, the degree of environmental degradation, et cetera. So there's broad multilateral commitments to increasing transparency and information sharing and tracking along supply chains. We see along these different initiatives, and I think is a really great step forward. We also see, right, so moving up, that very, very similar language that's used in supply chain resilience for the core of US-Japan, and the Quad is also used in the resilient economy pillar of IPEF. So resilience related, all right, so this is about supply chains, and it's really focusing on the same sectors and measures that are pursued in the other initiatives. So having early warning systems, trying to map critical mineral supply chains. In this region, there'll be a big focus on nickel, for example, that's used in batteries, as well as rare earth supply chains, as well as others as well that are particularly risky, such as cobalt, although that comes from a different, that's a little bit more complicated. And as well as, right, improving traceability and then coordinating on diversification. And this is, again, largely diversification from China, but it's also just diversifying from any sort of geographically concentrated production. So, for example, nickel in Indonesia. Some challenges. So we've already heard a lot of challenges. I agree with everything I've heard. Some of the challenges with IPEF that David outlined earlier, the domestic challenges of what was distasteful about TPP continues to be so, right? So that's where there is overlap. That's just going to be a difficult sell. All parties want to try and pursue these initiatives with economic inequality concerns and social inequality concerns at the forefront, but the countries have very, very different economic interests. And so, like most international economic cooperation, it's going to be very difficult to satisfy all domestic constituencies. I do think supply chain resiliency is a way that there are more win-wins and easier win-wins, and that it will be easier to walk that line of writing rules without a formal trade agreement, or if the United States would like to lead on rulemaking, and that the United States can cooperate with Japan, and Japan can lead and the United States can co-lead, and think about how to build more resilient supply chains with avoiding some of the politics of trade. So I'm very optimistic there, particularly focusing on concrete measures like shared standards, transparency, and thinking hard about how to try and sell these other measures like costly digitalization, cybersecurity measures, et cetera, that are involved in supply chains to make those more palatable to partner countries. So thank you so much for listening. I look forward to the conversation, and I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Kristen. You provided a lot of materials for us to work with, and I'm really grateful that you've identified specific sectors. We've seen a plethora of new initiatives, and it's great to see how some of these new initiatives are not simply identifying problems and ensuring that governments are on the same page in assessing the risks ahead, but also coming up with a roadmap to meet some of those issues. I'd like to now turn to Shikata-san. I'm assuming that Japan will sign on to all 4 pillars of IPEF. Of course, Japan and the United States already have trade deals, so in some respects, there isn't a lot of new ground that will be covered as a result of signing on a bilateral in a bilateral way. But that said, there is this greater expectation for the United States and Japan to really be that standard setter. And there are rising expectations for the 2 countries to kind of be that model to show how cooperation and coordination can be met, especially on an issue like supply chain resiliency in the technology sector, which does depend a lot on private sector input, sharing of often sensitive information and data. How do you see specifically on the US-Japan cooperation on these and some other issues actually outlined by IPEF?
So thank you very much. I was a trade negotiator until last October before I joined the Kishida administration. And many of the points that were made by other panelists were very, very insightful and thought-provoking. So I kind of, I'm tempted, to go beyond the official, lines of the Japanese government. Maybe, a couple of points I wish to comment is, my view is that TPP remains to be extremely important. IPEF cannot entirely replace TPP. There may be some overlaps at the end of the day, but the TPP continues to be important. And before accession, it is kind of difficult, for you to make the case that the TPP needs to be renegotiated. And this is a unique kind of a political discourse on trade agreements, especially in the US Congress, in my view. Second point is, as Kristen mentioned, I have lots of sympathy with how you characterize, this bilateral agreements and Quad and IPEF. And of course, after US withdrawal from TPP, we negotiated between Japan and the United States trade agreements, as well as digital trade agreements. And as was mentioned, last year, core partnership focusing on supply chain or technology issues. And it has lots of economic security or economic statecraft, components. And Kishida administration has been working on this economic security related measures, including submitting bills and this parliament passing, some of the bills as related to economic security legislations. At the same time, when we are negotiating among 14 countries, it's going to be cutting edge, new economic talks, and it will go, IPEF will go beyond existing trade agreements. And we are very much looking forward to seeing that. And as Christine mentioned, there are actually, those rules could be the basis for new investments across the Indo-Pacific region. So hopefully we'll be seeing new areas for investments in the growth sectors in close partnership with the private sector. So, for example, last week when Prime Minister Kishida met with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, there was agreement that Prime Minister Kishida's Digital Garden City idea could be kind of collaborated with Singapore's Smart Nation Initiative. And then there are issues, such as digital rules, and so these are very important issues for us to tackle. And as you are well aware, non-TPP members of ASEAN, such as Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand are coming on board. And as was mentioned, India, and very importantly, Fiji came on board. So we are looking forward to having talks among like-minded countries in the inclusive way and sustainable way. Oh, Shoko-san, I kind of forgot your initial question. Sorry.
It's okay. I think you covered a lot of ground there, and instead of repeating my question, I actually have more questions that I'm hoping that both you and the others on this panel can address, and that is this whole issue of economic security. We talk a lot about trusted partners. We also, are considering this emergence of technology spheres and emergence of bubbles or spheres of trust and cooperation. Japan has actually been very proactive domestically to try to boost its economic security and, quite frankly, reduce dependence too heavily on China as a market. It's named an economic security minister to a cabinet post. The economic security legislation has recently passed. How does Japan's approach to domestically to economic security kind of resonate in the United States? And is that a kind of prerequisite for countries to be more involved and engaged in some of the key pillars of trade and in furthering economic relations? I see Kristen nodding a lot, so maybe I could turn to her as well as David, and if Sony and Shikata-san have comments, that would be really great.
Thank you. So I think that one of the really important things here is when we, I like how you put the spheres of trust and cooperation, that one of the goals of Japan's new economic security bill is to try and facilitate cooperation at both at the university level, research level, but also in the private sector between Japanese companies and US either companies or maybe publicly funded research centers, et cetera. So in these more kinds of sensitive technologies, these very new emerging technologies, there were concerns that there were just legal barriers for Japanese United States cooperation, and the economic security bill managed, or one of the goals is to try and remove some of those barriers in order to be able to deepen cooperation in sensitive emerging technologies. And so when we think about, so for example, the Quad had this new Quad fellowship, which I think is a really neat initiative. But in some of those cases, right, it might not be possible to do collaborative research across borders in very sensitive technologies that could increase perhaps resilience or a more geographically diverse basis of new technologies and new research without maybe a Japan-like economic security approach, or some other kind of approach.
I would just note that I think Washington, D.C. is very happy to see the economic security legislation passed. I noted that it was actually mentioned in the joint statement where President Biden had noted it. I think it's part of an evolution that Japan's been going through for a number of years, including their amendments to their investment screening law to scrutinize investments, particularly from state-owned enterprises like China, more carefully. And I think Japan's been a leader, and I think the United States and Japan are coordinating well on strengthening their respective domestic regimes for reviewing these kind of things. One comment I'd make real quickly is, in some ways it seems like U.S.-Japan relations, I mean, they're as good as they've ever been. Maybe they're in some ways too good. We have so many different initiatives going on: IPEF, Core, Quad, 2+2, U.S.-Japan Partnership on Trade, GSEP. I mean, it's really hard for me to keep up with what's going on. And I really have a fear that there's just too much. And there's too much for the Japanese bureaucracy to handle and the U.S. bureaucracy. And there needs to be a bit more focus on results and making sure this is getting where we want to go. So that would be one recommendation I would make for people to think about. Is we have a lot of things going, and that's a great thing, but it also leads to, I mean, sometimes it's not as favorable as it could be.
So yeah, just quickly on the supply chain issues and kind of economic security, I think there was a bit of a concern when Yellen mentioned, Secretary and Yellen mentioned friendshoring and kind of the issues kind of moving forward with that. Obviously Japan has been putting quite a bit of effort in some kind of diversification, even back in 2010. I think Christine wrote quite a bit about it, so I'm not the one to be talking about that. But anyway, after the rare earth, the kind of export ban from China and things like that. So China +1 has been, kind of Japan's playbook for a while now, more than 10 years. While I think in Japan, there has been some sense of this kind of producing where the consumption's done. I think Japan has a much kind of a shorter, kind of sleepy kind of a phrase for it. But I think that's kind of a ways in which the risk is reduced. And obviously, the Japanese businesses are not going to leave China altogether. China itself is a significant, kind of a site of consumption. So that's where it's going to kind of end up. Meanwhile, there are quite a bit of a conscious effort being done, especially on the part of even businesses looking at the risks that come out with some of the weaponization and so on and so forth, to diversify its production sources from places like Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations.
Thank you. So just a reminder to our viewers that we are taking questions. You can email us at asia@wilsoncenter.org or tweet at Asia Program. We have a question from Paul Sarsik, who asks about Taiwan and the possibility of a US-Taiwan FTA. And I think what I should probably add to this is that although Taiwan had wanted to join IPEF, it was not for political reasons. And at the same time, the United States has developed a new trade initiative with the Taiwanese government. We know that Japan has been a strong supporter of Taiwan. I am hoping that someone would be brave enough to discuss how Taiwan can actually be incorporated into the broader trade regime of the region at the moment.
As an observer of American trade policy, I do understand that there has been bilateral trade talks between the United States and Taiwan. And my impression is that it may be the case that many of the agenda items between the United States and Taiwan have overlaps with the agenda items of IPEF. So if there are kind of common standards between the US and Taiwan, naturally, Japan has very significant trade and economic ties with Taiwan. So there could be eventually harmonization of the regional standards. So this is one point, and more and from another perspective, as many of you know, we have been welcoming Taiwan's semiconductor investment in Kyushu and TSMC's investments, and this is regarded as important concrete projects as we promote our own economic security related policy, especially in the field of semiconductor. Thank you.
May I just add one quick note on Taiwan? Obviously Taiwan has applied to join CPTPP. I think 6 days late after China, mainland China did. So Japan is any indication I see from Japan is totally welcoming that application. Meanwhile, the way that how it's feasible for Taiwan to join would have is a significant connection to China's application. So the WTO model is always talked about as these two join CPTPP together, while China, how long that it takes China to join CPTPP is probably still being debated.
I would just say that I think things worked out pretty well for Taiwan. I mean, they weren't able to be part of IPEF, and I think we all know that would have spooked a lot of Southeast Asian nations if it had been. But they got this new dialogue with the United States government that seems pretty substantive. And so I think that they actually landed in a good place, all things considered.
Yeah, and there is also speculation too that the US-Taiwan initiative could actually move forward much more quickly than IPEF, which does embrace a lot of divergent countries with various interests, whereas the Taiwan initiative really focuses on specific interests and is targeted as well. I would like to turn to a question from Congressman Mark Kennedy, who is a global fellow with the Wilson Center and also President Emeritus at the University of Colorado. What he asks, what would success look like in a year or two to match the current enthusiasm for IPEF? Of course, that is assuming that there is great enthusiasm. I think David outlined that there are really two camps, right? So there are those who are realists and those who really have concerns, who still look towards CPTPP. But I'd like to ask all four of you this question. Success for IPEF in 1 or 2 years' time.
I think the success is I think everyone's going to focus on the trade pillar, frankly. I mean, I'm not to downplay the other pillars, but that's really going to get the most attention. And so some sort of document that sets out rules that are agreed amongst the parties on labor, environment, digital, maybe other topics, sanitary, phytosanitary, competition policy, trade facilitation. Some sort of document needs to be produced, and probably something that suggests about enforcement and how it will be done. But we have the US-Japan example for years. We did negotiations or discussions with the Japanese, and we produced out of different initiatives, regulatory reform initiative, a document that was a political document. And if the United States didn't follow that political document or Japan didn't, then we would point it out, say, hey, you're not doing what you said you're going to do. And so that's what I see as being probably the most concrete outcome, is some sort of document where countries have said, all right, we're going to do this. We agree on this. And then if they don't, then it's up to the other countries to say, hey, you said you were going to do this and you're not. And that's going to be that's going to be what I'm going to be watching for.
Okay, may I?
Of course.
Sure. So I think it is very important to think about possible merits or benefits of participating countries. And it is realistic to try to produce concrete results at an early stage where it is easier to reach agreement. And we think, that these areas, the fields that are included under IPEF, are interesting, or it interests most of the participating countries. So if we could try to pursue the balance, between cooperation and the rulemaking, that is, I think, is very important, especially when there are developing country members participating in the talks. So if we could kind of balance between cooperation and the rulemaking, from the Japanese viewpoint, we are interested in supporting, human resource development or technical assistance, capacity building for some of those developing countries to agree on the potential provisions that would be emerging. Thank you.
Can I second Shikata-san's note on this cooperation rulemaking? All these are crucial part, and definitely, the question is the kind of old saying of where is the beef thing, what kind of benefit can this framework provide for many of the developing Asia? And also, I think that ultimately the most important is how many of them will come on board on the 4 pillars. I guess it's kind of a menu approach, but this is, probably in a kind of significant way a comprehensive one. So that's one, and also, kind of how many of them kind of enter beyond the current 14, kind of going beyond. So that's how to expand, how to make them as resilient is probably the key feature.
I can chime in very quickly. Thinking about supply chain resilience, what would success look like even if there are small step mechanisms to try and increase supply chain tracing and transparency, maybe a dashboard where ways to track things that would solve some private sector problems in the region. It would help if IPEF can help de-risk some of these industries, particularly minerals, and improve the information environment, that could lead to some really great concrete outcomes but it's within a sector. So at the sort of the voter level, it's harder to see, but I would count that as a great success.
Great, thank you so much. So we also have a question from Danielle Fumagalli, Director for Japan at the Office of Japan, Korea, and APEC with USTR. She asked to David and Shikata-san in particular, David mentioned that it may be too much of a good thing with the amount of economic initiatives between the US and Japan. Do you have any thoughts on what should be prioritized? Also welcome thoughts from Shikata-san if he's able on what Japan's priorities are.
Shall I go first? Thank you, Danielle, one of my former colleagues, for asking a tough question. I guess I'll just answer rather generally that there just seems to be a lot going on right now in the US-Japan space, and it's hard for me to see some of the concrete results. And I think supply chains is one example where there's just a lot of discussion about supply chains, and I think it's very important work, but it's harder for me to see what the government to government dialogues are doing here and what they're producing when it's, the private sector is huge to this. So I guess I would like to see a bit more, I get in general, a more narrow agenda with focus on actual results. It's just a lot of different initiatives and a lot of difficult government coordination is what I would expect is occurring.
I may just try to address three issues. You could make an observation that there are too many initiatives between Japan and the United States, but I think it represents true broad, comprehensive nature of our bilateral ties. So I think, of course, we may need to focus on some of the tangible, progress during coming months and years. But as related to IPEF, there are really important agenda items. Digital is something Japan has been trying to promote under the concept of DFFT. So if we could agree on relatively high standard digital agreement under IPEF, that's a big plus. Number two is supply chain, which has already been mentioned. This relates to the cross-border investment and technology transfer after COVID and facing Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so not to talk about US-China rivalry. So supply chain related matters are really important in promoting our public-private partnership. And very lastly, let me just mention that we didn't have much time to talk about climate change. And Japan is very much eager to support Asian countries' energy transition. And this is something which I think fits Biden administration's emphasis on climate change measures, but we need to come up with a realistic roadmap for energy transition, eventually carbon neutral. Take an example of ASEAN countries, each ASEAN member's energy policy landscape is different. So we need to agree on rules and try to support, especially ASEAN countries' energy transitions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shikata-san, and thank you, David, Saori, Kristen, for joining us here today. There is certainly a lot going on between the United States and Japan. We know that this is a good thing. Certainly Japan welcomes it. Washington is eager to work together with Japan. I know that we could continue this conversation, and I certainly hope that we will have future opportunities to see how these various initiatives are progressing and meeting some of the common goals that the two countries have. But for now, I just want to say thank you again for joining us, and we all look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.